We're going to begin this breakout session by focusing on housing and planning for housing. David Hermans is the Policy Director in MBIE's Housing and Urban branch, where he provides strategic policy leadership across the government's work programme. So please give David Hermans a warm welcome.
Do I need to do a presentation? Oh, there we go. Cool. Kia ora koutou. So I'm here to talk to you today about the government's Urban Development Authority, or the decision to establish one. In the unenviable position of having a succession of senior government ministers erode the novelty of this presentation over the last sort of day or so. So in the interest of managing your expectations, some of what I'm going to tell you may be familiar to you, but it probably bears repeating. And I also should say that Cabinet's currently currently taking decisions on this, and so I'm not able to reveal all the details to you. But as Minister Twyford signalled yesterday, you can expect more detailed announcements soon. So I don't even know how to use this. There you go. So I'm going to start a bit with the problem definition because it's always the best place to start. And we heard a bit yesterday from the Minister about this, and also from David Norman about the ongoing challenge. The simple fact is we've failed to build enough houses over the past decade or more, and by our calculation, over 45,000 shortfall. Others have different calculations. The Council and Reserve Bank all have different methodologies for estimating this. But they're all pretty much in the same kind of order of magnitude, and they all reveal a problem. But not only haven't we been building enough houses, we haven't been building enough kinds of affordable homes that we need to meet the evolving needs and preferences of New Zealanders. And from about 30% of dwellings being built in the lower quartile price in the 1980s, we're now down to 5% over the last while, which is not many. There are a bunch of underlying reasons for that, but amongst them is a persistent undersupply of small, higher density typologies that are more likely to be affordable and meet people's locational needs, or many people's locational needs. But thankfully, as we heard from David yesterday also, the Auckland Unitary Plan appears to be having a positive effect now in this city, though there's still much work to be done to catch up with the deficit that occurred over that lost decade there. And ensure we continue to meet our future needs. The undersupply has all placed pressure on prices. That will be of no surprise to anyone. And rents led to a reduction in home ownership rates and increased demand for public housing. There's the home ownership rates. 1/3 of New Zealanders now rent. And the proportion of children living in a rented household has increased from 26% in the 80s to about 43% now. For low-income households, the proportion of household income spent on housing costs has increased from 29% in the 80s to over 50% now, and almost half of private tenants are experiencing some sort of rent stress. And to compound that, rental properties are generally in worse condition than owner-occupied properties. We care about all this because we care about the distributional impacts it has. It transfers wealth from the have-nots to the haves and exacerbates inequality. It restricts access to opportunity, and it directly contributes to all those debilitating social costs: poor health, social connectedness, educational achievement, income and prosperity. But we also care because it has wider productivity impacts. Poorly functioning housing markets and urban development systems restrict labour mobility, skew savings and investment away from productive tradable sector, increase macroeconomic risks and government costs, and exacerbate the business cycle. In particular, a poorly performing market has direct implications for the performance of our key urban areas, and in particular Auckland. In a world of biophysical limits, which we are in, New Zealand's going to be increasingly reliant on the wealth generated out of our cities, and in particular this place, through the kinds of high-value, knowledge-based activities that occur here. So a poorly performing housing market means a poorly performing urban economy, which means a poorer New Zealand. Thankfully, the government recognises that, which you've heard over the last day or so. It's not just a housing-specific problem, and its impacts so quarantined. This is reflected in the government's vision, which I've got up there on the screen, which is focused on the need to build thriving urban communities. Affordable houses, yes, but also access, connectivity, opportunity, sustainability. It's also reflected in the government's recent decision to create a new Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, which, if they play their cards right, I'll be transferring into, to provide pan-system leadership across housing and urban development. Because the problem does require a systemic focus and a multi-pronged approach. There are no silver bullets. So the UDA sits within the context of government's comprehensive housing and urban development work program. Specifically, it sits within that first key shift I've got up there, which is that the government taking a much more active role in the housing market and in the task of urban development, willing to play the role of a lead developer, to use its scale, purchasing power, its balance sheet, land assets, to partner with others and drive housing supply and urban development. So sitting alongside the UDA initiative, you've got KiwiBuild, additional investments in public and emergency housing, which you've heard about, and particularly the investment in the urban growth supporting infrastructure that we need, particularly the public transport investment, so crucial to supporting urban intensification, connectivity and accessibility. The second key shift up there is one you've also heard about quite a lot, which is the government's commitment to create the right kind of policy, regulatory and institutional settings. So within this, we've got the urban growth agenda, improvements to the building construction regulatory system, which we'll be talking about upstairs, improvements to the residential tenancy system to make life better for renters, and managing speculative demand for housing through changes to the Overseas Investment Act and the work of the tax working group, etc. The whole work program is really codependent, and the government and us poor officials have the unenviable task of trying to hit all of it reasonably simultaneously. I'll now talk a little bit about the specific rationale behind the UDA. So, as already mentioned, we think New Zealand's future prosperity will be reliant on the performance of our cities. We want our cities to attract and maintain communities of skilled workers, and we want our cities to be the engines through which anyone can access opportunity, improve their lives, and fulfil their potential. Modern cities that perform this function well have connected nodes of mixed-use social and economic activity. They provide opportunities for people to make real trade-offs between location, price, house size, typology. They allow people to make choices about where and how to live, work, get around. However, historically, our cities were often planned to restrict these choices, to distinguish between the places where people work and where they live, governed by planning regimes and infrastructure investment systems that supported inefficient, disconnected and homogenous land use, and which narrowed the choices available to people. This old approach of separating land uses, drip-feeding supply, and regulating how different urban activities should interact is now largely anachronistic. As our cities have grown, land values in central suburbs have risen, and historic land use patterns have become suboptimal as the needs of the city change. Successful cities embrace and enable this change. We're no exception, and we've well and truly entered a new phase of urban development involving the need to substantially redevelop our existing urban areas to meet the new economic, social and environmental realities, complemented by well-designed, well-connected and resilient greenfield growth. So this is driving the need for the redevelopment and development at a scale and pace that New Zealand hasn't had to support before, at least not for a long while. However, our systems and our existing urban patterns have been slow to respond to this new paradigm. Although the existing development system is capable of managing the kind of incremental change, complex or strategically important urban development struggles to proceed at the scale and pace required. The Auckland Unitary Plan, I'll give a nod to that because it's been a great step in this direction, and the government thinks that a UDA can complement that and help support that transition, just like it has in other countries. And this isn't a brand new idea for New Zealand either. In fact, some version of this concept has been considered by central government for well over a decade now, and at least we have a number of central and local government agencies that fulfil the UDA role to some degree, and you'll be familiar with many of them. Specifically, we've identified 4 key policy problems, policy issues that a UDA can help address. The first problem is limited coordination. Complex urban development needs coordination across the national, regional and local planning systems, including central government agencies, local government and infrastructure providers. Each of these agents has different drivers for their individual planning and decision making. It's important for complex urban development projects that their decisions and investments contribute to a shared rather than competing vision of the future, including aligning the timing, scale and prioritisation of a range of infrastructure investments, land use and operational location decisions. The second problem is fragmented land ownership. Unlike other countries, New Zealand has few large tracts of well-located derelict land or contiguous crown land that can be used for large-scale urban development. Therefore, the problem in the New Zealand context is how to amalgamate, either through ownership or partnership, smaller parcels of valuable urban land or greenfield land into larger blocks that permit meaningful development. We get coordination failures, hold-out, free rider problems at the moment. The third problem is central government has few direct levers with which to act in respect of particular urban development opportunities. This is generally desirable insofar as democratically elected local government is best placed to manage local issues. However, there is a need for central government to play a role when local issues have a national impact. In particular, the system of local participatory democracy is often weighted in favour of the preservation of the status quo and property owners. It doesn't often properly represent the interests of the people who require new housing, including future generations. Urban development projects, particularly intensified housing developments, are often opposed by a few vocal and influential groups, and consequently local authorities can find it difficult to even give effect to their own urban growth strategies. In addition, without someone willing to offset development cost and risk against future public benefits, exercising a kind of patient capital role that government is able to do, first mover and coordination problems can inhibit key urban development opportunities being realised, and this is particularly the case in less market attractive areas. The fourth problem is the one-size-fits-all development system. This is the general legislation governing urban development has to strike a balance between competing considerations and be consistently applied across the country. The result is a system that doesn't cater well for these special circumstances. And so where we've got strategically important urban projects governed by the same general settings as a backyard subdivision, which isn't ideal. So the government thinks and is committed to establishing a national UDA to help overcome these problems. In particular, it's going to consolidate as much as possible, or as is sensible, government's urban development delivery expertise into one centre of excellence, to then act as government's lead developer. We're too small a country to have our public sector capability in this area too widely dispersed. This will provide a lever for central government to lead and enable significant complex urban development projects, including as a key delivery mechanism for KiwiBuild. And in fact, the large-scale projects that will be taken forward by the UDA are expected to deliver a significant chunk of the 100,000 affordable KiwiBuild homes that the government wants to build over the next 10 years. But it will also support the provision of housing supply well beyond KiwiBuild, including public housing, community housing, rental housing, open market housing, commercial and industrial development, transport and infrastructure investment, parks, other amenities. It will have a mandate to pursue economic development and employment outcomes, good urban design, public transport and infrastructure provision. It will focus on the complete integrated urban development and the creation of thriving, sustainable and resilient communities. It will leverage publicly owned land, but it will have access to land assembly powers, including the ability to ask the Crown to exercise compulsory acquisition. It will be supported by a combined planning and decision-making framework for land use, urban design, land acquisition, reserves, transport, infrastructure, funding and levying powers, consolidating project decision-making. It will front-load authentic community stakeholder consultation, and this will be a core element in the establishment and design of any project. And looking overseas, and particularly at examples like Barangaroo and Sydney, where a lot of the problems that those projects encountered came because they didn't engage in that authentic sort of local representation and participation. But ultimately, the system will still need timely decisions to be made in the national interest. It will also focus on partnership with local government, iwi and the private sector It will focus on supporting others to scale up and improve their productivity. The role of the UDA needs to be seen within the context of a long-term plan to get the housing and urban development system back on a sustainable, even keel, self-sustaining. It can't do that by crowding out the private sector. And a point I want to emphasise is that while the UDA will have access to a range of bespoke planning, funding and other powers, its main value add arises from its ability to overcome the coordination, fragmentation and scale issues that have plagued urban development in New Zealand. That is, it's the entity in itself, its way of operating and its organisational design and scale that is more important, I think, than the regulatory powers that it might have access to. It may not even need to use any of those tools or powers in many projects. So the result will be another mechanism alongside the Auckland Unitary Plan, alongside ATAP and other initiatives for helping ensure our cities can accelerate the kind of dynamic urban change process that is necessary to support their contribution to New Zealand's future prosperity and well-being. So we're now hopefully at the business end of what has actually been a pretty long-term project. So as mentioned, this began in a sense with the work of the Sustainable Urban Development Unit, which was part of the House Prices Unit back under the 5th Labour government in 2007 or so. It was resurrected near the tail end of the last government, where MB consulted on a discussion document in 2017, and many of you probably would have submitted on that. Pleasingly, there was a degree of alignment either side of the last election on the potential role of UDAs in New Zealand, which meant that we were able to draw on the extensive feedback from that consultation exercise to actually inform our advice on the current government's priorities. And as mentioned, Cabinet is currently taking policy decisions on the development powers and entity structure, which it will continue to do over the next couple of months. And this will inform the drafting of a bill for introduction, but likely in early 2019. I mean, that's tentative timing. Further announcements will, of course, be made by the Minister. But it's important to note also that that doesn't mean that we're not getting on and doing stuff in the meantime. We've set up the Kiwi Build unit within MB, and that's already scaling up and working in partnership with existing entities like Housing New Zealand, like HLC and TRC, to really consolidate government's work program in this area ahead of the establishment of this UDA. So that's me, I think. Ngā mihi nui. Time for questions?
So just a few questions. The top rated one at the moment is, what lessons have you learned from Christchurch, given they have a Crown Development Agency, a Council Development Agency and a joint Crown Council Planning Agency?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one of the main lessons we've learnt from the Christchurch experience is actually the point I made earlier, which is the one around the authentic community participation and in the project delivery. And I know there was a lot of expectations created at the beginning of that Christchurch rebuild process around what kind of say the community would have in the design of the new Christchurch, and I don't think those. It took a long while for that. Well, there were a number of false starts, and I think there were a lot of dashed hopes in that respect. And so I think we've learnt a strong lesson from that around actually building in that participation and that engagement at the outset is going to be crucial for actually delivering over the long term.
This person wants to know, what democratic processes will the UDA be required to follow when aggregating brownfield land? It seems like there are property rights issues.
So I think the point to make here is that we won't have access to a compulsory acquisition regime that's any different from the existing Public Works Act. In fact, it'll likely use that, subject to final decisions being made here, of course. But the point being, it's just really clarifying that the purpose of urban regeneration and urban renewal is a valid public work, essentially, alongside transport and education and other things.
Thank you very much. Please put your hands together for David Hermans.